My daughter told me I could stay with her family, but only if I earned it. Her words came not as an invitation but as a bargain, sharp and cold, delivered in the very kitchen where I once taught her how to make pie crust with butter-stained fingers. If you want to stay here, Mother, you'll need to help out. Babysitting, cleaning, laundry, whatever needs doing. This is not a nursing home. She said it as if she were being practical, but practicality wears cruelty like a mask. I stood there, holding my granddaughter in my arms, her small body warm against me, her diaper half fastened beneath my wrinkled hands. The television murmured from the living room, where my son-in-law entertained colleagues over glasses of wine. The glow of their laughter floated down the hall. I was a shadow on the edge of their celebration, neither seen nor heard, existing only to keep the baby quiet. Then came the words that cut deeper than any knife, "You're not even worth my child's diaper." I froze. The baby squirmed softly, unaware of the storm around her. My daughter's voice, my own flesh and blood, slashed through me like glass breaking. I had heard thoughtless words before, from strangers, from tired patients during my years of nursing, even from my late husband in moments of frustration. But nothing compared to hearing my own child strip me of dignity in my most vulnerable season of life. I wasn't a ghost. Not yet. I still breathed. I still carried life in my chest. But in that moment, I felt myself fade, as though my presence were nothing more than smoke. "Finish that diaper and get out of my sight," she said. "This is my house. If you want to be here, you have to work. Babysit, clean, be quiet. Don't expect to just sit around." The words echoed across the polished hardwood, carrying through to the living room where the men laughed louder over wine. And then, the cruelest echo, my granddaughter, barely able to form full sentences, whispered, mimicking her mother, "You're not really family, Grandma." She didn't know what she said. Children are sponges, absorbing tones and repetitions. But the mimicry stung more than anything else. Out of the mouths of babes, the weight of truth sometimes falls heaviest. I held still, diaper straps loose, my hands trembling. All the memories swirled before me, years of waking at dawn to make breakfasts, nights of sewing costumes for school plays, afternoons spent tutoring my daughter through math problems she thought impossible. All of it seemed to dissolve into dust, blown away by a careless sentence. I backed away slowly, fastening the diaper as best I could. My feet carried me toward the kitchen, and the laughter in the other room swelled as though mocking me. I heard the click of the nursery door closing behind me, soft, final. No tears came. Not yet. On the counter, a cup of tea sat cold where I had left it. Beside it was a small vanilla cake I had baked for myself that morning. It was nothing extravagant, just enough for one. On the table in the corner stood a framed photograph of my late husband, smiling at me in a moment long before this bitterness settled into our family. His eyes, even stilled in glass, gave me a steadiness I clung to. I placed the cake beside the photo. I pulled the last faded rose from a vase, left from the anniversary bouquet I had bought myself, and laid it gently next to the cake. Then I lit a single candle, its flame fragile yet brave, flickering as though it, too, refused to be extinguished. I closed my eyes. I did not wish for forgiveness. That would have been too large, too hollow. Instead, I wished for something simpler. I wished to be acknowledged. The kitchen hummed with silence. I thought of the years I had given, decades of nursing, holding hands as life slipped from soldiers' bodies during my service in a field hospital, nights I never slept so that others might live. And then, the years of motherhood, trading those same steady hands from stitching wounds to tying shoelaces, from guiding breathing to singing lullabies. I gave all of it to my daughter. And here I was, repaid with disdain, reduced to a live-in babysitter who could stay only if I scrubbed floors and swallowed insults. Yet in the quiet, I smiled. Just barely, but enough to feel my own strength return. Because they didn't know the truth. They thought this was their house. They thought they were being generous letting me stay. But I knew differently. I had funded the down payment. My name was still on the deed. I had arranged everything months ago when they assumed I was too old, too frail, too clueless about money. One phone call was all it would take to remind them. I blew out the candle. Darkness settled around me, but it was not frightening. It was steady. Tonight, they thought I was invisible. Tonight, they laughed at my expense, my granddaughter repeating the cruelty she didn't understand. But I was not powerless. Not even close. The papers waited, signed and ready. The lawyer I trusted was one call away. They saw me as a tired grandmother with flour on my apron and fading strength in my hands. They mistook silence for weakness. They didn't know that silence can be the sharpest weapon a woman has when she has been erased too long. They would learn. In that quiet kitchen, with nothing but the shadow of a rose and the faint smell of vanilla cake, I felt something shift deep inside me. I was not defeated. I was waiting. And my waiting was nearly over. Every morning, I remind myself, I was not always this invisible. Long before my daughter's words hollowed me out, I lived a life full of purpose. I was a nurse, steady and strong, in a world that demanded endurance. My hands once stitched wounds, steadied breathing, and kept soldiers alive long enough for hope to reach them. I worked in a military field hospital where mortar fire rattled the walls and the air smelled of antiseptic and fear. I held men's hands as they whispered final words, and I pressed cloth to wounds that should have taken entire teams to manage. One evening, a captain I had helped save slipped a medal into my hand. "For courage under fire," he said. My name etched on the back, the government's stamp of approval on the front. I never told my daughter about it. When she was born, I placed the medal in a drawer and left it there. My service was no longer to my country but to her. I traded my scrubs and boots for soft blankets and lullabies. I gave up promotions, pay raises, and recognition for school drop-offs, Halloween costumes, and science projects that had to be redone at the 11th hour. I left a life of headlines for a life of whispered encouragement. And I believed it was one of the finest choices I had ever made. But now, as I bent over to change my granddaughter's diaper, I heard the cruel revision of my story. "You left your career because you were weak, not because you sacrificed. If you were really that competent, you'd have your own house instead of babysitting in mine." The words belonged to my daughter. Her husband nodded silently beside her, his eyes cold, his smirk sharper than any scalpel I had ever held. They dismissed decades of labor, love, and loyalty with a shrug. I looked around their home, a house whose down payment had come from my careful savings, from years of pinching pennies, from selling jewelry my late husband had bought me when we were young and foolish and thought love could outlast everything. On the shelves sat trophies of my daughter's academic years, most of them earned with my coaching, my tutoring, my staying up late to review flashcards until her eyes stopped drooping. Yet those trophies gleamed while my sacrifices were invisible. I once believed motherhood was its own form of medal, a recognition carved into the smiles of our children. But sitting in their dining room while my son-in-law's colleagues asked who I was and my daughter laughed, "Oh, that's just mother. She only shops thrift stores. Don't mind her." I realized motherhood had been rewritten into a liability. They erased me without hesitation. At her promotion party, one of her co-workers had asked if I was the housekeeper. My daughter didn't correct him. She laughed and said, "She just dresses that way. You know how old people are." I smiled politely then. But inside, something cracked. Not in my gratitude, no, gratitude was long gone, but in my silence. All those years I had carried them, financially, emotionally, practically, and now they placed me lower than the hired help. At least the housekeeper is paid. And yet, I continued to serve. I cooked meals. I folded laundry. I read my granddaughter's stories in the softest whispers, her small head resting against my arm. I thought if I just kept showing my worth in deeds, my daughter might remember the truth. But my efforts were swallowed whole, vanishing into the endless list of chores no one thanks you for. The irony stung the deepest. The woman who once kept soldiers alive was now called a burden. The mother who once stayed awake night after night was now told she didn't contribute. The grandmother who rocked her granddaughter through colic was told she was lucky not to be in a nursing home. Sometimes, late at night, I stood in the hallway outside their living room, where laughter and clinking glasses echoed from their parties. I would listen from the shadows, out of sight, waiting to be invited in. But the invitations never came. Once, I was told bluntly, "Mother, you must dress more tastefully if you expect to join us." I changed my clothes after that. I wore long skirts instead of the floral dresses I loved, because apparently flowers made me look cheap. I swallowed that humiliation like I had swallowed so many others. But silence is not emptiness. It is storage. And mine was filling to the brim. I carried in me the weight of every diaper changed, every meal cooked, every wound healed on battlefields, every lullaby sung to restless children. My silence had become an archive, and one day, I knew it would be opened. That realization came sharper one night when I tried to share a story at dinner. My granddaughter had asked me about the medal she had once glimpsed in my drawer. I smiled, spoon in hand, ready to tell her about the night I held a soldier's hand through the longest hour of his life until dawn broke and we both knew he had survived. But before I could finish, my daughter cut in, "Enough, Mother. We don't need your war stories at the table. This is a family dinner, not a history lecture." She raised her wine glass as if sealing my silence with a toast. My son-in-law smirked at her side. I set the spoon down, its clink louder than I intended. My chest tightened. Not with anger, but with a grief so deep it left me breathless. It wasn't just that they didn't want to hear me. It was that they wanted me erased. After dinner, I retreated to my small corner of the house, the old office where I had been given a bed squeezed between filing cabinets and leftover boxes. I turned the light low, sat on the edge of the mattress, and opened the gray folder I had hidden beneath the quilts. Inside were the documents that proved my invisibility was a choice I had allowed, not a truth carved into stone. The deed still carried my name. The reverse mortgage I had nearly paid off with my pension was structured in such a way that if anyone tried to sell without my approval, ownership would revert fully to me. I had built these safeguards quietly, methodically, while they assumed I was too old to know better. They thought they had me cornered. But I was the one holding the keys. I placed my hand over the folder, the paper cool beneath my palm. I thought of the long winters when I shoveled snow so my daughter could catch the school bus. The mornings I packed her lunches. The nights I sat awake while she cried over heartbreak. I had given her everything I had. But I realized something in that dim room: giving everything does not mean giving yourself away. I closed the folder and slid it back under the quilts. My silence had reached its limit. I would not scream. I would not beg. I would not plead for recognition like some weary supplicant. No. I would wait. And when the time came, my silence would turn into the one sound they could not ignore: the thud of a gavel, the stamp of a notary, the quiet authority of my name inked on a deed. They thought I was invisible. But I had never been more present. There is a kind of power that doesn't announce itself with raised voices or slammed doors. It sits quietly, folded in manila envelopes, waiting for the right moment. I learned that truth not from motherhood but from nursing. Paperwork, I discovered, could save or destroy lives. A missing signature, a wrong date, an unchecked box, such small details determined whether a man received his treatment or was left to languish. Records could rewrite reality. So when I became a mother, I carried that lesson with me. And when I became a grandmother, discarded, diminished, told I was not worth a diaper, I leaned on it again. My daughter and her husband thought themselves invincible. They strutted about their suburban castle, planning kitchen renovations and new cars, laughing about weekend getaways they could fund once they unloaded the house and moved somewhere grander. They never asked my opinion. They never considered that I might even have one. I was the ghost in the corner, useful only for folding laundry and keeping their child occupied. But while they were laughing and sipping wine in the living room, I was meeting with a lawyer in the quiet office of a downtown building. I had chosen him carefully, an older man, soft-spoken, who understood both the law and dignity. He knew my late husband once, and more importantly, he respected silence as a form of strength. He did not ask me to explain why my daughter treated me the way she did. He only asked what outcome I desired. I want to ensure, I said, that if they ever try to sell this house, it cannot move an inch without my permission. He nodded, adjusted his glasses, and slid a stack of papers across the desk. We can make that happen. Your name is still on the deed. With this structure, you hold the veto. I signed quietly, my hand steady, the pen leaving ink like a quiet declaration, I am still here. When I returned home that evening, my daughter was too busy scrolling through her phone to ask where I'd been. My son-in-law barely looked up from his laptop. They assumed I had gone to the grocery store. I let them believe it. Silence, I reminded myself, was my sharpest weapon. Weeks passed. I continued my routines, cooking, cleaning, reading bedtime stories to my granddaughter. I played the role of the live-in help so convincingly that they never suspected a thing. And all the while, they spoke freely in front of me, as though I was deaf as well as invisible. One evening, I overheard them at the dining table. My daughter leaned across to her husband, whispering excitedly, if we sell, we can finally afford that place near the lake. Think of the space, the prestige. This house has served its purpose. I kept my back to them, scrubbing dishes in the kitchen sink. I dried my hands slowly, folded the towel neatly, and placed it back on its hook. They didn't know. They had no idea that their grand plans balanced on the thinnest thread, and that thread was mine to cut. Later that night, while they laughed in bed about countertops and patios, I sat by my window in the small office-turned-bedroom. I opened my folder again and traced my name on the deed with my fingertip. I thought of my granddaughter asleep down the hall, her small breath steady, her innocence still uncorrupted. I thought of how easily children repeat what they hear, and how dangerously words can shape them. If my daughter insisted on treating me as a burden, what would my granddaughter grow up believing about age, about family, about worth? Would she one day cast me aside the same way? Would she learn cruelty as casually as she learned nursery rhymes? No. Not if I had any say. This was not just about me. It was about breaking a pattern before it hardened into legacy. The confrontation came sooner than expected. One Saturday morning, as I set out to make pancakes, I overheard them on the phone with a realtor. My daughter's voice carried down the hallway, sharp and triumphant. Yes, we're ready to list the property. We'll need an estimate by next week. For the first time in months, I let myself laugh. Not loudly, not cruelly, just a soft chuckle that rose from my chest and surprised even me. I flipped a pancake with a flourish, the golden circle sizzling as though it shared in my secret. By Monday, their excitement had curdled into confusion. The realtor's office had called back, explaining, politely but firmly, that there was a problem with the paperwork. The sale could not proceed without the consent of all owners. I was one of those owners. I watched as my daughter stormed into the kitchen, her hair unkempt, her phone clutched like a weapon. Mother, she snapped, what is this nonsense about your name being on the deed? Why didn't you say anything? I set down the dish towel, wiped my hands, and looked her straight in the eye. My voice was calm, steady, the same voice I once used to soothe frightened soldiers. Because you never asked. Her husband appeared in the doorway, his face pale with shock. You mean to tell us you've had control over this house all along? I folded my hands in front of me. Not control. Partnership. That was the agreement when I provided the down payment. Nothing moves without my say. The silence that followed was heavy, thicker than any silence I had endured before. It was no longer the silence of invisibility. It was the silence of power shifting, of arrogance unraveling. My daughter's lips parted, but no words came. My son-in-law opened his mouth, then shut it again. For the first time in years, they were speechless before me. And I felt no need to gloat, no desire to raise my voice or list my sacrifices. The paperwork spoke louder than I ever could. I turned back to the stove, flipped the last pancake onto the plate, and set it on the table. Breakfast is ready, I said softly. They sat down in stunned silence. And as my granddaughter toddled into the room, rubbing her eyes, I placed a pancake on her plate and kissed the top of her head. She would remember this moment not for the tension that hung in the air, but for the quiet certainty in my voice. This was the beginning of my reclamation. Not with anger. Not with bitterness. But with the quiet power of paperwork. After the realtor's call, the house was different. The air seemed heavier, not with cooking smells or laundry detergent, but with unspoken tension. My daughter and her husband no longer spoke freely in front of me. Their conversations hushed the moment I entered a room. They glanced at me like I was a stranger who had overstayed her welcome, except now, they knew I had every right to be here. At first, I let them stew. Silence had carried me this far, and I trusted it to carry me a little longer. But I also knew silence was not the end. Silence was the prelude. The confrontation came one evening after dinner. My granddaughter had gone to bed, her small voice echoing down the hall as she asked for just one more story. I closed her door softly and returned to the kitchen. My daughter and son-in-law were waiting, sitting at the table like judges behind a bench. We need to talk, my daughter said. I sat across from them, folding my hands in my lap. This house, she began, her tone clipped, was supposed to be our step up. Our chance to move forward. You've complicated things. I don't understand why you would entangle yourself like this. Why you would hold us back. Her words stung, but I did not flinch. I entangled myself, I said slowly, the day I wrote the check for the down payment. The day I sold my jewelry. The day I gave up pieces of myself so you could have a roof over your head. This house is not your stepping stone. It is our home. My son-in-law leaned forward, his voice sharper. With all due respect, you're not the one paying the mortgage now. You don't contribute. I turned to him calmly. I contributed before you ever set foot in this neighborhood. Without me, this house would not exist for you to pay a mortgage on. He looked away, his jaw tightening. My daughter's face reddened. You always do this, she snapped. You always make it about what you've done for me. I didn't ask for sacrifices. I didn't ask for you to give up your career. That was your choice. Stop holding it over my head. I let her words hang in the air. They were sharp, but I had heard sharper. On battlefields. In hospital wards. In the cries of the dying. My dear, I said finally, you are right. You didn't ask. But I gave anyway. That is what mothers do. And though you may try to erase it, the truth of it remains. I will not allow you to rewrite my life into something small and weak just because it suits you. Her lips trembled. For the first time, I saw not arrogance but uncertainty. I stood then, slowly, deliberately. My knees ached, but I would not let them see weakness. I walked to the sideboard, opened the drawer, and pulled out the gray folder. I set it on the table, the papers heavy with their silent authority. This, I said, tapping the folder, is not a weapon. It is protection. For me. For the years I have left. I will not be discarded like an old shoe. This house cannot be sold without my consent, and I have no intention of giving it. My daughter swallowed hard. So what now? We just live like this? In limbo? No, I said softly. What happens now is that I choose my future. For once, I choose for myself. Underscore 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 underscore. The next weeks were quiet, but not with the silence of invisibility. It was the silence of decisions being made. I began visiting senior living communities, not the kind my daughter threatened me with, where residents were parked in front of televisions, but places with gardens, libraries, classes, and friendships waiting to bloom. I spoke with other women my age, women who had stories like mine, erased, diminished, yet still alive beneath the surface. For the first time in years, I felt possibility stir inside me. When I returned home from those visits, I found my daughter watching me with a mix of suspicion and fear. My son-in-law avoided my gaze altogether. Their dominance had cracked, and they didn't know what to do with the space that opened up between us. One evening, I gathered them in the living room. I will not stay here forever, I told them. Not because you've asked me to leave. But because I am choosing to leave on my own terms. I will find a place where I am not a burden, but a person. Where my stories are not interruptions, but legacies. My daughter's eyes widened. You'd leave? Just like that? I smiled gently. Not just like that. Thoughtfully. Deliberately. The way I've lived my whole life. My son-in-law finally spoke, his voice low. And the house? I looked at him evenly. You may live here as long as you like. I will not take it from you. But you will remember that it exists because of me. And if you ever try to erase me again, you will find the law standing in your way. There was no anger in my tone, only certainty. And certainty, I knew, was harder to argue with than rage. The day I moved into my new apartment, the sky was impossibly blue. The air smelled of cut grass and fresh paint. My granddaughter clung to my waist, her small arms tight around me. Grandma, she whispered, will you still read me stories? I knelt down, brushing her hair back from her forehead. Always, my love. Always. My home will never be far. I kissed her cheek and pressed a small book into her hands, a collection of my favorite stories, with a note inside, these belong to you, because stories are how we remember. My daughter stood at the doorway, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Perhaps she expected me to cry, to beg for one last kindness. Instead, I smiled at her, a smile that held both forgiveness and boundaries. You may not see it now, I said quietly, but one day you will understand. I am not leaving because I was pushed out. I am leaving because I chose myself. And with that, I walked down the path to the waiting car. My new place is small, but it is mine. The walls are lined with books. A garden waits outside, its soil ready for seeds. There is a knitting group on Tuesdays, a writing workshop on Thursdays. People smile when I enter a room, not because they need me to fold their laundry or scrub their dishes, but because they want to know me. At night, I sit by the window with a cup of tea, the quiet hum of life around me. I take out the metal from its drawer, polish it gently, and place it on the mantel where it belongs. Not hidden. Not erased. For the first time in a long while, I feel whole. I am not just a mother, not just a grandmother, not just a burden or a shadow in someone else's house. I am myself. And that, I realize now, is more than enough. There are women who stitch their families back together with trembling hands and unbroken will. Women who carried kindness through years when no one applauded. Women who remember every detail, especially the ones others worked hard to erase. If you're ready to hear them, if you believe in stories that don't shout but linger, then subscribe to Grandma Shadowed Truths. These aren't just tales. They're testaments. They're what rises when a quiet woman finally speaks, not to beg, not to condemn, but simply to tell the truth. After 75 years, here's what I've learned: revenge doesn't expire. Wisdom doesn't hurry. And when a grandmother speaks, the world leans in. So stay a little longer. Pull up a chair. Listen not only with your ears, but with the part of you that remembers what it feels like to be unseen. Because the next story you hear may sound a lot like your own.